Welcome to Bass Talk with Hagen and Hayes. Today's topic is the Eccles Sonata. Good afternoon, Susan. How are you?
I'm good, David. How are you doing?
Very well, thank you. And how did you first come across the Eccles Sonata?
Oh, the Eccles Sonata I learned as a student, right as I was about to learn how to play in thumb position. Notice how I said about to learn how to. I didn't quite know it yet. And, it has a little bit of thumb position and a lot of that transition in and out of
Hmm.
thumb position. And the first movement was the first thing I learned, obviously. And I thought it was beautiful, except for the parts where I had to transition in and out of thumb position, which just sounded like a dying cow. And I remember thinking, there's got to be a better way to do this. But I'm trying to remember how old I was. I was maybe in the ninth grade, maybe in the eighth grade. So probably like 13, 14 years
Hmm.
old. Now, how about you? When did you come across it?
Not until I was about 17, because I didn't start playing till I was 13, 14.
Right.
And I was just learning playing thumb position. So I did the first movement and
Mm-hmm.
I played it in a festival, a competitive festival.
Me too.
Uh, but one of the first solo I ever did, and one of the rules is you weren't allowed to play from photocopies. And
Ah.
I only had a photocopy because my teacher, well, I hadn't bought it, and my teacher hadn't told me, so I just had this photocopy. So I had to try and learn it from memory,
Mm.
try and read over the shoulder of the pianist.
Oh,
It
there
didn't
you
look
go.
particularly, yeah, so it didn't look particularly professional, if I'm honest. And I had a memory lapse as well, and
Oh,
I didn't win, obviously, but that was the first time I played it. But I loved it from the start, and certainly that first movement is
yeah. Oh,
absolutely
yeah.
gorgeous.
Yeah, what's interesting is I had to do it for like an orchestra, little like a district competition
Mm,
within the state of Massachusetts where I grew up, and we had to do just the first movement.
mm.
And my teacher said, "Oh, well, why don't we go on and learn the second movement?" I said, "Okay, I did." And I learned the third movement. And then she sort of became disinterested in the piece. I never learned the fourth movement
Mm.
until I went to teach it years later. And I was like, oh, right, there's a fourth movement. I've never learned it, but let me teach it to this student. And I think I saw why she didn't want to teach it to me.
Mm.
It wasn't up her alley, really. And I'd probably been on the piece for quite a long time, and she probably wanted to bring me somewhere else musically. But I still think that that first movement is quite lovely. I really
Mm.
do. Um, I don't know how you approach it with your students, but when I'm teaching it, I like to give my students the tools of being able to play in thumb position and being able to get from the danger zone to thumb position
Mm.
and back before I give them the piece. Because for me, that piece was how I learned to do that.
Mm.
And I found it to be, it wasn't like it was stressful, but maybe discouraging at times because it would just sound god awful. And I think if I can teach the students to make the da ya da 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 ya da 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 coming down the G
Mm.
um, easily, then they get more excited about the piece rather than discouraged.
I think I was taught it in the same way as you. I
Yeah.
think I was taught to play the piece and learn the technique at the same time.
Yeah.
So nowadays, my students are learning to move in and out of thumb position anyway.
Right.
So I never even think about the technique of doing it because they're doing it all the time.
Right.
But my second teacher was a man called Lawrence Gray, and he was a really great teacher. I really loved lessons with him. And he was the one who introduced me to lots of different repertoire, Edward Nanny's concerto, and all these things from the Paris Conservatoire. And so I did all four movements with him.
Nice.
And I've still got all the fingerings in the pod. I still got from 40 years ago.
Yeah.
It's still, yeah, I still love it. Each movement has something different. And it's interesting as a professional or as a student, how there's a lot to learn technically as a student,
There
but as a
is.
musician, there's so much there musically as well. And
Yeah.
I think it's a great sonata. I think it's probably played too much, but I can understand why it is.
I think it's played a lot, and I'm not sure that, well, you'll know better than I, how many other pieces there are that teach the same types of things. Like the third movement, it's beautiful, it's lyrical.
Mm,
You have to deal with the difference between triplets and duplets,
mm.
um, and, major and minor, and it's, just sort of more of an emotional movement. The second movement has, you know, chords and fast notes and, all these patterns, sequences really.
Mm.
And it's great. And I've had trouble finding another piece to put in its place.
I think that's the problem because it works. And there aren't many transcribed violin cello sonatas of that period which
Right.
work as well because they're just moving into that nice register, that nice singing register.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's interesting for an audience because it's out of half position. It's nice to play for the student or the bass player, and it's very easy on the ear. I remember Gary Carr always used to start every recital with a Baroque sonata, and often it would be the Eccles, and I can understand why. It's a beautiful 10-minute start to a program.
Right, right. It is. And it's very funny because I hear it played, and I was taught it this way too. Despite it being a Baroque sonata, I hear it played very romantically often,
Mm,
really lush and a couple of subtle, tasteful but slides that you probably
mm,
never would have done in the Baroque time period. And so then I was taught, and I love to teach this at Berkeley, in the first and third movements when there's repeats. You go back and use what I would call ornamentation,
mm.
but at
Yes.
Berkeley, I call it Berkelification. Because for me, and I did this with the Vivaldi sonatas when I was in college, you know, a repeat in those days wouldn't have been played exactly the same,
No.
right? There'd have been a difference. So I think it's a really good way for any type of player to learn how to express themselves by,
Mm,
the chords will stay the same, but if for a classical player, maybe add a run, add a
mm,
trill, add a turn, add a lower neighbor, any sort of appoggiatura.
mm,
But I sometimes make my jazz students or my bluegrass students put it into their language.
mm.
Even if it means they chuck their bow quickly, I call it the chuck and pluck when they're at Berkeley. Chuck the bow in their quiver and do some sort of pizzicato thing.
Yeah.
But nowadays, I encourage creativity. I mean, when I was a student, it was like, here are the 7 flavors of ornaments you can
Mm.
use, and that's all you can do. And now, do you have students use ornamentation on the repeats?
All the time. Yes, and often I'll play them the version I play, and then it's up to them what they want to do. It should be personal because I think in the Baroque times, every player it was just part of their armory. They knew
Yes.
how to improvise and
Yeah.
ornament these things,
Yep.
elaborate, and they would have just done it anyway. You're saying about no slides.
Mm.
My teacher, Franjo Posta, was really hot on that. No slides in Baroque. He
Right.
wouldn't have that at all. So that
Yep.
one I've kept and with my students. But
Yes.
I think sometimes it's played romantically because the edition we all use is quite romantic.
Yeah.
And we all think it's Fred Zimmerman's edition. In fact, the bass part is, but the edition is by Alfred Moffat. And
Ah.
he was a Scottish composer. Um, and he I think died about 1950. And he was asked by a publishing company in London to edit lots of these old sonatas. So he researched all these old Baroque sonatas, early classical sonatas, and wrote accompaniments for them.
Okay.
And I think the Eccles one, I think it was first published in 1905.
Oh, wow.
So that's why it's quite romantic because in those days the elaboration of the grand bass, the figured bass
Yeah.
was quite romantic.
Sure.
So I can quite understand how the solo bass line will match the accompaniment. Having said that, I still think it's a really nice accompaniment. I know
It is.
it's not baroque, it's not urtex, it's not anything, but it's really quite lovely. I have to say.
I also like that I can play it. I feel like it's one of those accompaniments that isn't too hard for a
Yes.
teacher to be able to play.
Yeah.
So I love being able to play the accompaniment. And in my office at Berkeley, my back is towards the players
Mm,
when I'm accompanying them. It's just the only way we fit in the room. But it's a shiny black piano, and I told you I
yes.
can kind of sneak a peek and really see their left hands. But I love being able to play, whether I'm playing bass or playing piano with my students. I feel like it's really helpful.
Yes.
But I love that this accompaniment is accessible
Mm.
to a teacher. It's not so hard that you just can't do it. And I think it's really helpful for the students too.
Mm. Do you know, I haven't taught it for years. And then I taught one of my ex students last week, and she's doing the middle two movements.
Ah,
and it's so nice to come back to it. It's
yeah.
not a piece I teach because I think if pupils have to do auditions or things, the panels get so fed up of hearing
Oh yeah.
saying often they want a Baroque sonata, but they don't want the Eccles because everyone plays Eccles. So I always try and be really creative in what I find for my students.
What will you do in lieu of that?
Well, there's a nice Handel concerto, which oboe concerto, which was originally arranged by Simandl.
Okay, yes.
And I've done a new edition of that one, and I really love that. It's really nice music, much more technical than the
Mm.
Eccles.
Yep.
And then George Speed has done some new editions of the Vivaldi
Right.
sonatas. He's put them in new keys, which puts them into a nice solo register.
Yep.
So my students have played some of those. But that's the
Yes.
difficulty, the Gamba sonatas by Bach.
Mm.
Again, another student played the I don't know, I can't remember which movements. Maybe it was the whole thing. I can't remember. I think Sonata number two in
Hmm.
D major, which is lovely. It's a really nice sonata, but it's difficult to find Baroque repertoire which is accessible, isn't it? Which
It
is
is.
not too challenging.
Yeah, I'll have some fairly new to the double bass students that very proficient electric bass players that want to become doublers, and they'll come to my to lessons with me and they'll say I want to play the Bach first cello suite, and I'm like, okay, we got to get you there, we can't do that this week. So we need some stepping
Mm.
stones, and but I know the students a lot of times at Berkeley love the Baroque time period as far as music
Mm.
goes, and I think part of it is that it's, there's logic, there's symmetry,
Mm.
there's it's accessible to the listener, but
Mm.
I think sometimes it's a lot harder for a double bass player than
Mm.
it sounds like it's going to be, and so they're surprised.
Mm.
Every now and then I'll have a student, it's not frequent, but a student will go rogue and will be like, I know you told me not to learn this yet, but I started to work on it. And then they pause. This has happened twice. It's really hard. You're right. I'm not ready for this. And that's when I'll pull out of a Vivaldi or an Eccles, no, or an easy Bach piece,
Mm. Yes.
um, it just to let them have a
Mm.
piece in the time period they're liking. But then I'm a little bit of a sucker for the romantic time period, so then I'll pull out something from that and introduce them to a composer that maybe they don't know.
Mm.
Um, but yeah, I think the Eccles is a really great piece. It teaches so much. There was a time period before I taught at Berkeley when I taught this piece a lot, and I
Mm.
had a student's mom she was a professional violinist, and she came into the lesson one day and she said, "You said to my son that you're teaching him the Eccles Sonata." I said, "Yes, I am." She said,
Mm.
"This was written for violin, and his name is Henri Eccles. I don't want you saying the wrong thing to my son." And I said, "Okay." Um, as an American, we butcher people's names without knowing it. And after that point, I was like, "Oh my God, what do I call him? How do I pronounce his name?" I started to get very paranoid. So you call him Eccles.
Because he was English,
See?
but
Sorry.
he worked in France, and I
And
think he died in Paris.
he did. And I had said to this woman, I wanted to be very careful with her, but I said to her, "I believe he's actually English." And she said, "No, no,
Mm.
no, he's French." I said, "I don't think so." I said, "I think he's English." I said, I know that he spent time in France."
Mm.
I said, "But I am pretty sure his name is Henry Eccles, but if you
He's,
want
he's
me to,
he's
I'll
from a
call him
family of
Eclair."
musicians. His father was Solomon Eccles,
Right.
and his brother, who was more famous, was John Eccles, who was
Mm,
quite famous in his day. And there
mm,
was a story that Henry didn't think he was getting a fair crack at the whip in England, so he ended
ah,
up in Paris. And I think he did much better there. I think he had a good career, and I think we only know him because of these 12 sonatas for violin. Um, so Alfred Moffat must have found this sonata and created edition. Maybe it was for violin, maybe it's for cello. I know it's played on the viola quite a lot.
yes.
I
I
know
think that
that.
a lot of instruments love it.
Yeah, I think so. So, and I think the first time we played it was Kuzovitsky. I think he was the one. I think in his collection there's a hand copied version of the sonata, I think.
Okay.
But I think, as I say, the Fred Zimmerman edition from IMC is really just based on the 1905 edition.
Okay.
And the bass, so the bass part was new, and the I think the piano part is probably the same one for
Hmm.
cello or violin. But it works really well. So I can't see much point in changing it. I have found a new piano accompaniment, which is really it's different.
Oh, tell me about it.
So well, I'm not going to say too much until I've done it. But it's actually really quite nice, and it's completely different to this one. Um,
Okay.
and as far as I can see, they're both really good editions, the Moffat and this other one, and they both bring something different to the table. So
Mm,
still this beautiful music, but with just slightly different colors. And I thought that might be interesting to do new editions for both solo and orchestral tuning.
so we should be keeping our eyes peeled for that.
You should be.
Now, here's the big question.
Yes,
Will I be able to play the piano part?
yes, I think so. I think they're both quite accessible.
Good.
And I think the other version is maybe a little more baroque than the Moffat,
That's
which
good.
hmm, but it's I, I don't really understand about being two text because we're playing it on the wrong instrument in the
Right.
wrong tuning with the wrong strings at the wrong pitch. Um,
Other
so
than that, it's perfect.
exactly. So I'm really not too worried. So even though the Moffat accompaniment is quite romantic, I think it's quite lovely actually. I
Yeah, it's very pretty.
Yeah, I think he did a very good job, and there's a reason why it survived all these years.
Yes.
Maybe it's
Yeah.
quite good.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
I think that happens. And as we both said, you have to look for something else that would replace it. But I kind of like the Baroque and romantic mixture that
mm,
has happened with this piece because
yes.
it has the brain of a Baroque composer.
Mm.
But every now and then we just sort of romanticize how it sounds a little bit. It's kind of a nice combo. But as we both know, I am kind of drawn to the romantic style of play anyway. So, um, yeah.
But the one thing in the first movement is the bass notes are all doubled; they're all octaves. And I
Yes.
have to say, when I play for my students, I lose the bottom octave.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Just clears up the piano part a little bit, so it's a little bit less romantic.
Yep. Yep.
And I think that really helps with the textures. Otherwise, everything is in that low register.
True.
Mm,
Yeah, that's a good point.
mm.
Um, I do love that bottom note though. My mom was a piano teacher, and when I was a baby, I'd kind of crawl around. The piano studio was
Yes.
attached to our house, and so I'd be crawling around in the room where she was teaching, and I would always she had a beautiful Steinway piano,
Mm.
and I would sit up against the back leg of it, and it was near the bass notes. And I mean, even as like, this is when I was a year old, I loved the vibrations of the lowest notes on the piano. My mom said she knew I was going to end up playing the bass because I was always just sort of curled up against that leg of the piano because that was the one that vibrated with the bass notes. And a little bit quirky, but so when I play that piece, I sometimes will keep the bottom note and drop the upper note of the octave,
All right. Yeah.
which really isn't good, but it's just, there's no musical explanation for it. It's more like Susan likes this.
But I've paid for all the notes on the piano. I may as well use them.
Exactly. There's
Yeah.
88 of them. I'm not going to skip any of them. Well, maybe the top octave that
Yeah,
doesn't get played as frequently.
exactly. But I think it's nice because it is accessible as a teaching piece.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
also, uh, many of the times we play to an audience, they've never heard a bass before. And
Right.
to play something like this, which is lyrical, a bit of virtuosity in there, the whole thing only lasts 10 minutes, give or take.
Right.
Um, so it's really there's nothing there to frighten the horses, as they used to say. It's
Yes.
everybody. It's a win-win, I think, with this piece.
I think it is too. And as you said, I could perform it, you could perform it, and it wouldn't feel like, oh, you're playing a kid's piece.
Mm,
And there's not a ton of the pieces that I learned growing up. There's not a lot of them that my teachers would have performed in a recital.
Mm.
Even my teacher, Ed Barker, when I was studying the Vivaldi Third Sonata with him, he put it on a recital. I was so excited. I went to the recital. He played the whole thing up an octave, and I felt like such an idiot. I was like, here I am struggling with it down an octave, and he just sort of whipped it off. I was all up in thumb position, and and he really went to town with it. There was a harpsichord, there was a cellist, playing the
Yes.
basso,
Yeah.
and he played it in solo tuning, and it was all the stuff that I thought, wow, I am such an idiot. Look at what he's doing with this piece. But I mean, would I perform a Vivaldi sonata in a recital now? Not sure that I would, but I still think the Eccles would hold up nicely.
I think the key works really well on bass because
It
it's G
does.
minor. It gives us the open strings and the harmonics, so there's a resonance there. And
Right.
that for bass, that's a really good thing. It's also moving into that nice sort of low solo register, which is quite nice. And it's a
Yeah.
register where you can really sing and where you can really show what the bass is about. It's not just the low notes. It has those as well, which is important. But it just takes you into the middle register, which is really nice.
Right. And it's great for a student who's not quite ready for the upper register yet,
Mm.
but they feel pretty sophisticated because, you're going a little bit into thumb position and you're hearing how beautiful the bass can sound.
But the one thing I'm going to do with my new editions is lose tenor clef if at all possible.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. You
That
know,
that's how I learned tenor clef with that piece. I
Me
have to say.
too. Me
Yeah.
too. Now that you mention that, that's exactly what I did. And it's funny because when I first started teaching at Berkeley, I gave this to a student and he looked at me and he said, I don't know this clef. And he turned ashen. He was so nervous. And I said, okay, so let's learn tenor clef. And he said, oh, what if I just transcribed it and just put it entirely in either bass clef or treble clef? I can play both of those. And I gave him a couple of weeks with it in tenor clef, but I knew that he had a bit of a learning disability.
Mm.
And I said to him, you know what? What if you transcribe it? Put it in, I have to check it, make sure you didn't make any mistakes, because if you're not great with tenor clef, I don't know you're gonna write it right. And he did get a few notes wrong, but he fixed them very quickly. And so I have just sort of it's typeset very poorly, but it's a treble clef version of the piece that I just keep in my back pocket in case anyone else panics when they see tenor
Mm.
clef, which I find tenor clef is becoming a little bit passe.
Mm. I personally I like it, but that's only because I've learned it and played it for all these
Me
years.
too.
But a lot of my students don't like it, but they
Yeah.
have to learn it because it will come up in their orchestral repertoire. I know it
Yes, it
all
does.
the time, and it's better to know it, and then you're ready for it. Really.
Absolutely. Oh yeah. I say to my students, it's like knowing three languages, bass clef, tenor clef, and treble clef. We have to know them interchangeably. And I get to the point, and I promise them this will happen to them if they're devoted
Mm.
students. Um, you don't even think about what clef you're in. You just see
Mm.
it and you do
Yes.
it.
Mm.
And every now and then I'll be teaching a piece and I'm talking about a measure in the middle of the line somewhere. I'm like, oh wait, hold on, what clef are we in? Okay, yeah. So when you play that B, but I have to double check it. But I do think it's really important to know all three clefs because
Mm.
it's definitely in the orchestral rep. I remember the very first time I saw tenor clef was in an orchestral piece, and I was in youth orchestra, and I think I was in maybe the seventh or the eighth grade. And I looked at my stand partner and I said, "Oh, I think the composer must want this to sound tight and nervous because he put it in tenor clef." Like I didn't understand it wasn't the composer's doing, and I certainly believed that they were looking for a
Yes.
specific nervous sound because none of us at that point really knew tenor clef very well. And I've carried that memory with me my whole life, remembering, remember the first time I saw tenor clef? Oh, yeah, it must have to sound nervous.
It's funny when people say I don't like tenor clef, and I would say, well,
Mm.
life is fraught with difficulties. This is one of them. Just get over it. But they come back the next week, and over every note there's an E, F sharp, and G.
Right.
I get rid of those. I rub all those out straight away. And
Yes.
little by little, they learn how to to do it. I'm going to write a book about tenor clef because it's really very simple how to learn it.
It
You
is.
only need to learn if you learn three notes, give or
Yes.
take.
The
You take the
landmarks.
others from there.
Yes.
It's
I,
really
I do
quite
the
simple.
same thing. I
Mm,
say to them, okay, first week, here are your landmarks, your open G, your D, and your octave G.
exactly.
Learn what those look like. Are those the three that you
Yeah,
use?
completely.
Yeah, and I say to them, memorize these three. And it's like your multiplication tables when you were a kid. Memorize these three. That's all you need. And from there, you can figure out what all the other notes are because you can say, this is a G and it's one ledger line above. Okay, it must be a B.
Yeah,
Easy.
yeah. It's not difficult at all, but it's just I think giving them the confidence that they can
Yes.
do it.
Yep. Yep.
But this was the one piece where I learned tenor clef, and I use tenor clef as well. If I'm transcribing a piece, it might be a violin piece, and I
Mm-hmm.
look at it and I read the solo violin part as though it's in tenor clef.
Yep.
So if it's in treble clef, top A, one ledger line,
Mm-hmm.
um, then on bass that's a G
Mm-hmm.
because that's in G major, sort of in G major, and I can see if it's going to work on the bass where it's going to fit.
Right.
And it's a really good way of doing it. So I use tenor clef all the time. The difficulty I find, a friend of mine, Miroslav Gajdosh, he writes almost everything in tenor clef,
Mm-hmm.
and then he writes octave sign above it.
Oh,
And that one
yes.
is a killer, I have to say.
Yeah, that's too much math, I think.
Yeah, that one I do struggle with. Is working out what the note is, then the register. But yeah, but I think I read it really well. It's and once you do, it's easy. As you say, it's like treble and bass. It's not a problem.
Right. Right.
But coming back to the Eccles Sonata, when do you introduce it? What's the criteria for you?
The criteria for me, I really want the student to be able to get, no, comfortably. I would love for them to be able to get up to that D harmonic on the
Yes.
G string, to be able to, scales, arpeggios, and as we talked about last episode, getting through some of your books,
Mm,
so that I can have them really comfortable. And I think, honestly, I don't think it takes super long for them to get there, but I want
mm,
them to be comfortable in the Scaling the Heights book,
mm,
which is the third George. There's two Georges, and then
yes.
Scaling the Heights, which is the getting from danger zone to thumb position. I want them to have been able to do a few pieces in there,
Mm.
but I don't find that it takes terribly long to get to that point.
Yeah, the one thing I like is that second note, the B flat in the
Oh, it's
first movement,
beautiful.
because that one is like your first term at school. It's so long, and
It
that's fantastic
is.
for bow control.
Yes.
And if they can do that one, then it's easy after that. It's really nice.
Yep. Yep.
Mm.
Oh, so many times you hear like da 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 da, and I'm like, what just happened? But I'm picky, but it's okay. Now, what are the criteria for you when you're teaching it?
It's usually for an audition, if I'm honest. It's not a piece
Mm,
I would usually choose to
right.
teach.
Yep.
But sometimes if they need a Baroque sonata or they want something a little bit different, then I'll
Yeah.
introduce it.
Yep.
But I love the third and fourth movements because
Hmm.
they're not played as much. It's always the first and second.
Right.
But I like them because they don't quite work on bass. You
Hmm.
have to be really inventive with fingerings. And I
Yeah.
like the fourth movement because it's quite virtuosic.
It
And as you
is.
say, it's going in and out of thumb position, which is
Yep.
quite nice. It's
Yep.
really interesting. I also like the third movement because it's quite sonorous.
It
And that there's a
is.
sort of a depth to that movement, which is the first movement is very operatic, very lyrical. But the third movement is completely different. It just has this dark feel about it. And
Does.
when you talk
It
about
does.
color and about line,
Yeah.
these pieces are really good for that, I think.
Yes, they are. I find that, well, we were talking about this before we started recording today. Um, I used to teach it a lot. When I first
Mm,
started teaching, I taught the pieces that I had learned.
yes.
And then, of course, I expanded what I had learned. And I taught it a lot when I first was teaching. Now I do something that could be considered, uh, I don't know, some people might not agree with it. I'll sometimes teach just one movement of it. If I have something that I really feel like the student, like bow control in that
Mm,
first movement, or the rhythm or the musical depth of the third movement, there are sometimes things where I'll just teach one movement of it.
mm,
I remember though, there was one semester, I think it was my first semester teaching at Berkeley. And I had all my students had their end of semester exams back to back. And I very stupidly had a lot of Vivaldi and Eccles Sonata students just coming in, and I was like, oh my God, I need to mix it up a little bit. I hadn't really thought about it. Since then, I've taught the Eccles far less. I think probably
Mm,
one movement 2 or 3 times since then. But I do find it to be very effective
mm.
when I'm teaching it. But I usually use it for a specific reason.
I've produced a couple of books of pieces just in bass clef,
Mm,
unaccompanied bass or bass and piano, and I think I'm going to do a new version of the first movement in bass clef.
nice.
So it's down
Okay,
into D minor, down a fourth.
nice.
And again, it's just in that nice register where they're moving around a little bit,
Yeah,
but stays in bass clef. So I thought that might be a nice addition
that
for
would be
younger
great.
players. Yeah, so
Yeah.
I've thought about that one. That's sort of on the list when I start putting the next book of bass clef pieces together.
Oh, I think
Because
that's
it's nice to
great.
introduce different styles of music.
Right, right.
Mm,
It is. It is. And, like you said, it's a piece that's held up through all these years. So it
mm,
obviously has merit.
mm.
Even though I may not teach it quite as frequently as I used to, I still think it's a really lovely piece.
It is. It is.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's a reason why it survived.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
and it's funny that he's really a one-hit wonder almost, Henry Eccles.
Right?
If it
Yeah.
if it wasn't for this one sonata, he probably wouldn't be remembered at all.
I think you're right. When you Google him, that's the first thing that comes up is that sonata,
So it's nice that
including,
he's
yeah.
remembered, isn't it?
He is. It is. I mean, we should all be so lucky.
Exactly. Exactly.
That's great. Well, this is wonderful. I think this is a great piece, and I think people should keep their eyes peeled for a new edition coming out. That's exciting. Well, thank you everybody for listening to season 2 of Bass Talk with Hagen and Hayes. Like and subscribe, and thank you to our sponsors, GraceGalleryDesign.net, and a special thank you to Leatherwood Bespoke Rosin for sharing with both David and I their newest rosins, which we're really enjoying, and I think we'll be talking about those pretty soon. But thank you so much to Leatherwood. Everybody,
Bye.
take care. Bye bye.
Bye.